Hello and Ya Ali Madad. My name is Rayhaan Merani and I will be the moderator for today's critical conversation. This series of critical conversations has been conceived as an ITREB USA initiative aimed at engaging the entire Jamaat, but with a focus on 18 through 40-year-olds. This series aims to explore the critical conversations of our time and the questions within the context of our faith. Before we begin, in the spirit of social justice, land acknowledgement, and recognizing the history and exploitation of Indigenous peoples, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the ancestral lands of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes in the Denver area. Today, we're talking about social justice and Islam, agency and action. Today's session will provide an opportunity for us to explore the life choices and career paths that can be taken to live within the ethics of our faith and upend structures of inequity facing the marginalized in our societies. We're hoping that through learning about the three life stories of our wonderful panelists, we can demonstrate how to recognize structures of inequity around us and using our individual agency and action to create systemic change. During this session, you'll also see a Q&A box through which you can share additional questions or thoughts during the presentation. We will try to address as many questions as possible or submit during this talk as we can. If our panelists aren't looking at the camera, they're probably taking notes. With that being said, I want to take a moment and introduce you to our wonderful panelists. Imran Alimohammed has been a strong advocate for social justice from an early age and has been working to address it both through his professional career and volunteer work. He has served within our Jamaati institutions for the last 25 years with a specific emphasis on youth development and empowerment, including starting and launching programs such as College Expedition and Global Encounters, both of which focus on creating stronger communities through the advancement of youth leadership in our Jamaat. Professionally, Imran served as the founding CEO of Aviation Services East Africa, ASEA, a company that specializes in providing aviation services for airlines across East Africa. Prior to serving as the CEO of ASEA, Imran worked in various leadership positions at the Boeing Company for more than 13 years. Most recently, Imran has been working with the Aga Khan University's Graduate School of Media and Communications to run the Transforming Leadership for 21st Century Africa, which is the result of a novel partnership between the Aga Khan Foundation and Harvard University. Imran holds a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Southern California and a Master's in Public Administration from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, where he was the first person from the Muslim and gay community to be elected as the president of Harvard's student government. Samira Rajan is the CEO of the Brooklyn Cooperative Credit Union, a position she has held since 2008. She began at the credit union in 2001 as an AmeriCorp Vista. Its first loan officer, Samira is responsible for the development of all of Brooklyn Co-op's substantial programming, including the incorporation of its 501c3 affiliate, Grow Brooklyn. Samira holds degrees from Bryn Mawr College and the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. She was raised in Queens, New York, and currently lives in Brooklyn with her partner and 2 children. Farooq Mitha is a senior advisor for Muslim engagement for the Biden campaign. Previously, Farooq served in the Obama administration as a senior advisor in the Department of Defense. Prior to joining the Department of Defense, Farooq was a partner in the law firm Geller Mitha PA, where he focused on civil litigation, business transactions, government affairs, and administrative law. Farooq also consulted on issues and published several articles related to the Middle East and South Asia. Finally, Farooq is a co-founder of Mgage, a civic engagement organization which seeks to politically engage Muslim American communities. Farooq obtained his law degree from the University of Florida Levin College of Law and holds a BS degree in interdisciplinary health sciences from the University of South Florida. At the outset, we would like to note that the views of all of our speakers expressed during the course of this discussion are their own. We can now turn to our conversation. I'd like to begin by asking all the panelists, could you share a little bit more about yourself and your story? What are some of the inequities that you saw in your community that inspired you to take action? We can start with Imran.
Thank you, Rayhaan. First, I just want to say it's immense pleasure to be on today. Thank you for the opportunity. I really feel very special to be part of a community like this that offers this space to talk about topics like this, and the space for intellectual curiosity, as well as progress, community progress. So, I wanted to mention, as you mentioned in my introduction, Rayhaan, I currently work with the Aga Khan University. AKDN, as we all know, is a reflection of the social conscience of Islam. And I think that when we talk about social justice, it goes hand in hand with like the ethics of Islam. And for us, the Imam has been telling us, and for quite a long time, I think there's three parts to this. One is pluralism, understanding people's differences, people's diversities. Then from that, when you take the time to understand that, you realize that there are certain inequities in the world. So that would be part two. And then part three is, once you've seen the inequities, what are you doing about it? What change are you bringing? And how can you kind of resolve those inequities? And I think that that's a very large part or a strong ethic of our faith. So that really links to kind of my background, my childhood, the way I was raised. My mother really kind of instilled at a very young age that it was very important to leave the world at a better place than when you found it, help take care of the community. The skills that you have, they are about helping others, not necessarily for your own advancement. So that's really kind of what shaped my trajectory or my interest really in Jamaati work and also in my professional work too. I also want to mention two more things quickly. One is, I don't think that you can really think about, society's inequities unless you start looking at, your personal balance. And I know we're talking about a lot of this lately in terms of mental health, in terms of understanding your own justice. What do you need to be just to yourself? I think sometimes we forget about that. And for me, again, being gay at an early age, or realizing that really made me struggle of this notion of do I ignore what I need versus what the world needs? And thankfully, I was able to find balance in that over time. And I think that everybody has to figure out how to have balance in terms of intellectual, mind, your body, your soul. Otherwise, you really won't be able to help others. And then the last thing I wanted to mention was when we think about social justice and inequities, we all have a different viewpoint. And today's society is very relevant, right? In the sense that we all look at social justice differently. Depending on your background, depending on your understanding, people may have a completely different viewpoint. So where does your implicit bias, and what I mean by that, your way of thinking, shape the way you look at social justice? What you may look at in terms, what you may term social justice may not, or an inequity may not be something that someone else terms. So understanding a little bit about the way you think and the way you even view those in terms of inequities has, for me personally, been important when I've charted out what I want to do with my time.
That's amazing to hear, Imran. Samira, do you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself and your story?
Sure. Sure, thank you. And I want to echo also Imran's sentiments for gratitude for this opportunity. Thank you for the invitation. I think that it's entirely fair to say that our commitment, or my commitment to public service and to social justice, does come from my faith. When we were raised in Queens, and my parents have always been very deeply involved with the Jamaati institutions. My dad was president of the Northeast Council for a little time. My mom worked for a really long time with the social welfare. It's service that they continue to do in many ways. And both my sister and I had, I think, absorbed that at a very young age. We became volunteers, not REC teachers, that was too hard. but joining the camps, becoming camp counselors at Aluma. I think that, and then as we progressed in our education and as we understood more and more about the inequalities of the world around us, the ideas dovetailed perfectly. There was certainly a society of which we are parts. We have a role to play. It's not a role that's associated with monetary compensation. So service is important. Rayhaan noticed that my first year working at the credit union was as an AmeriCorps Vista, and the AmeriCorps Vista program is a volunteer program run by the federal government. It offers a small stipend, but it encourages people to work in community organizations as a volunteer for at least a year, and just to get to know what types of opportunities are out there. And I think that there's like a straight line, right, between the idea of doing seva in a Jamaati context, and then also going out there in the world and serving as well. So I would say that the link of serving has been foundational for myself.
That's amazing, Samira. And I love how a lot of this goes back to your faith for you, and I can definitely relate to that. Farooq, what about you? Can you tell us a little bit about your journey?
Yeah, I was in college at the University of South Florida. And if you heard in my bio, it said I got my degree in interdisciplinary health sciences. Well, I was pre-med at the time, like many people from our backgrounds are kind of programmed to be when we're going through school. And, in my junior year was when 9/11 happened. And I remember being in physics class and my mom kept calling my phone and I wasn't answering, and she kept calling me again and I kept not answering. Finally, on the fourth one, I was like, man, I better walk outside and see what's going on. And she told me what had just happened at the time with the terrorist attack. And I saw afterwards what happened to Muslims in this country, and the injustice, the discrimination, and really the lack of political influence or political presence in anything, whether it was at the state or local government or even in Congress. We had, at that time, I noticed really nothing in terms of political influence or the ability to mobilize and organize our communities to make a difference and to address inequities that were happening, not just towards Muslims, but towards the broader societies that we lived in. So I literally changed my career path shortly after that. And I said, you know what, this is cool. I like doing the pre-med stuff, but I think there may be something, a different life purpose that I might be able to pursue where I could have a different type of impact. And that's what basically sparked me to change my trajectory, go to law school, and then start getting involved in campaigns and politics and founding Engage and things like that. So that's the overarching story, but I'm sure we'll get into some of the details. And again, also, I really want to thank everyone for being here and for inviting me to be a part of this great conversation. I'm really excited and actually honored to be invited to be a part of this.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that story with us, Farooq. It is really great to have all three of you, and I'm really excited for the conversation that lies ahead. My first question is really to Samira and Farooq, to both of you. Both of you sort of decided to step away from just like generally specific any institution and try and go out and build something on your own. To take down and upend some of the systemic inequities that you were seeing within society. What kind of made you want to go out and do something on your own? And I think we can start with Samira here.
Sure. So this definitely doesn't come from my faith, but I've got this streak of anti-authoritarianism. Anyway, to be perfectly honest, it started as a dare. I had understood for a long time since my high school and college education that economic justice was important, that figuring out why resources are distributed unequally was going to be the work that I did. And my initial approach to it was to understand that the banking sector was at the heart, and at least in the United States, in determining how resources are distributed. So I worked at the Federal Reserve for a while. I worked at the Treasury Department. And before going to graduate school, I figured, well, that makes sense. If I wanted to be able to impact the banking system and how financial institutions work, then the Federal Reserve makes sense and the Treasury makes sense. That's where I'd be able to have impact. And then of course, then I get to graduate school, and one of my advisors said, this is, that must be fun for you, Samira, to be in your ivory tower, looking down at the rest of us and then telling us how we're supposed to do things. So how about you take a minute and go see actually how the money hits the streets? And I said, yeah, I could do that. Sure, I could do that. And so after graduate school, it took a little bit of work. I finished graduate school in the summer of 2001, and I came back to New York, and that was the summer that ended with 9/11. So it wasn't easy to find work. And then, but yet I still had this in my head that if I wanted to be credible, and if I wanted to really be able to bring insight into how the banking system can be shifted in order to accommodate better distribution of resources, then I should. He was right. Then I should spend some time out in the real world. And that's how I took the Vista position. Staying at the credit union was not part of the plan. The plan was to understand these things at a ground level, and then to be able to go back to this ivory tower and maybe be better at my job. As it turned out, retail financial services was intellectually and emotionally engaging and challenging in a way I didn't expect. And so I stuck around, and it has, of course, been, by now it is my life's work, and I'm proud of it. And with regard to your initial point about why create something that is outside the system, I think that the work at the credit union when I began, I understood it very quickly that the system as it stood needed better alternatives, that the people that I was serving, all minority, I work in dense urban neighborhoods in New York City and Brooklyn. These are historically Black neighborhoods. Bedford-Stuyvesant has history going back to post-Civil War. Bushwick is a neighborhood that is been populated by successive groups of immigrants, the Russians, the Italians, the Puerto Ricans, and now there's a lot of Chinese and Korean moving in. Other neighborhoods in urban Brooklyn, these are neighborhoods that have been marginalized for a long time, and they've never been part of the system. So it began as a dare, and then it became very quickly a revelation that in order for me to be able to make impacts on the way that the system works, I better find an alternative to this system. And that's why I stayed.
That's really inspiring. I think I can personally relate to having a teacher or a mentor give you advice that hit you pretty hard and made you make a pretty big change. Farooq, what about you? What was your motivation, and how did that sort of work for you?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Well, the interesting thing about, if I can kind of rewind back to when I was going through this change of getting more involved in civics and politics, actually what I wanted to do didn't even exist in the Muslim American community. I mean, I think back and I'm like, wow, like back in those days, and even really until today, Muslim communities have not had strong political institutions. And I remember, at that time in college saying, hey, it'd be great if we could start like a political action committee or some sort of a vehicle through which we can mobilize Muslim voters and things like that. But I felt really alone. I mean, I was literally in Tampa at USF, University of South Florida, in school thinking about this stuff. But there was nobody that I could really talk to because that didn't even exist in the Muslim community at that time. So I kind of, to be honest, just put the idea on the back burner because I just felt like, man, this is a big thing and there's no way I could do it on my own. And, I happened to get connected to some other people a year or two later who had the same idea. And then we all came together to form what's today called Mgage. But really, there was nowhere else for me to go if I wanted to do something within the Muslim American space. And we were the outsiders. I mean, I would argue we still are the outsiders, but in those days, we were really the outsiders. So, I was trying to create something that would actually make us insiders. So, it just didn't exist at the time. And it had to be done. More needs to be done. And a group of us came together and decided to build something new.
Okay. Yeah. And I think like that's definitely like a big part of what's paved the path for so many young people who have sort of found their way into politics from our community or just from the Ummah at large. Imran, my next question is for you. Institutions, often have legacy frameworks that aren't always progressive, that aren't always easy to change when it comes to, inequities and being able to reduce them. Given your passion for that, how did you manage those challenges within the organizations that you worked in and led, both inside and I guess outside the Jamaat?
Thank you, Rayhaan. Reflecting on that, I think my value proposition really has been around empowering people with information and knowledge to be able to assess situations to kind of bring about positive change in their communities or wherever they so choose. I do think, though, just to answer the question first, and then I'll give an example of what I just mentioned. I think people often struggle or get frustrated sometimes with working in organizations because they make some mistakes in terms of either trying to come in with action without understanding the situation. They sometimes don't read what the organization is, what it stands for, what the history is, what the values are, what some of the perspectives are from the different stakeholders. And it's very common for us, when we're appointed to something, that your manager, your supervisor automatically is saying, I want results. I want you to jump in. I want you to start making change. And that in a way sets us up for failure, because how can you bring change and results if you don't even understand this new organization and system that you've just stepped into, that has long amounts of history, that has embedded values, that has perspectives from all the different people that make up that organization. So I think that is always a challenge for me. And I think that when people think about bringing progress and change, sometimes they forget about the loss that the institution or the organization has to take and to kind of hold as they move forward. Even in a lot of the movements that are kind of all happening right now, there's lots associated with different groups by bringing in this positive change. And while it's overall better for the community, sometimes we forget what people have to give up to be able to move forward. And I'll just, give some real examples about that. So as you mentioned, I teach Transforming Leadership for 21st Century Africa at Aga Khan University. And essentially that is a program to be able to enable people to bring social change and to be able to understand how to assess the situation. Another program that I've been involved with, as you mentioned, Global Encounters, a program which you've been involved with as well. We try to do the same thing with global young Ismaili youth when they go to a new context, whether it's Kenya, India, Pakistan. How do we help them understand what the community is like? When we're looking at service projects, how do we help them understand what are the needs of the community? So we do a needs analysis. And then based on what they've learned, they try to come up with a partnership with the community. So coming back to your question, I think it's really about trying to understand what the community needs and how do you build partnership in a way that is paced properly. If you go too fast, people will reject it. And if you go too slow, people will, you miss an opportunity because you didn't have change fast enough. So generally, when I look at organizations, especially large ones, I see people getting frustrated really quickly because they don't do their due diligence about the organization, about the values. So when I try to look at bringing about change, and it's not always about inequity, but about social progress, I try to read the organization first.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that last piece that you just mentioned, right? So before working with any given organization, sort of taking the time to learn more about them before getting involved, what are some of the things, I guess, tangibly that you would ask people to do to get a better understanding of sort of where they're stepping into, and then also how do you determine and decide like what type of social progress you may aim to make in that organization, right? Like once you've done that due diligence and you've like become a part of an institution, I guess, then what's the next step to being able to enact the social progress, right? Or pursuing social justice in that regard.
Right. Great follow-up. So, I would say, I'll give an example of this conversation, critical conversations. I have seen a couple, but I've not seen all of them. And it's really easy when you're asked to join something or to speak, to be able to build something around what you think is the right thing. What I tried to do was I tried to talk to different people who have sat through different conversations, people who in critical conversations, people who were panelists, and people who were organizers. And I try to do that data collection and that gathering to be able to understand what is it that people are looking for, what were the learnings, and how based on that can I then create something that could be valuable for people. In terms of your second point, I think the issue really becomes that sometimes we have this bias of wanting to have personal change or gratification, and we really do it based on what our preferences are, what we want to see, and not necessarily what's best for the community or best for the organization. So when you're kind of thinking about what social change you want to bring, always try to ask yourself, why am I doing this? And is this something more for me, or is this something more that the community needs? And if it's something more that the community needs, how do I then build the partners around it? Because we're all motivated, right, by certain factors. We talked about it earlier right now too, in terms of our faith, and we're motivated to do certain things, but we have to kind of be conscious of those motivating factors and make sure that that doesn't overrun what's good for the community and what actually needs to be done.
Yeah, I think that's really important, like taking it back to like the larger mission for the organization or the community that you're trying to serve. And I think that's been a key component for what all three of you sort of described, is like taking it back to the people that you're serving and focusing on them to see what is best for them, and that lens of things. I guess my next question for all three of you is, what are some of the challenges and the obstacles that you faced that prevented you from, making change and from upending those systems of inequity that all of you saw, right? Like, what did you find were some of the greatest obstacles and barriers for you? And I think, Farooq, we can start with you on this one.
Yeah, there's probably no shortage of obstacles. I mean, look, when you're trying to make change, it's never easy. And I remember I was in a gathering of some Muslims, and there was an imam who was speaking, and he was like, if things were easy, it wouldn't be worth it at the end. And it's that challenge and the struggle that makes it actually worthwhile when you achieve whatever it is you're trying to achieve. But there's always struggles. I mean, I think, there's inherent struggles in the system. It doesn't matter what the system is. When you're trying to change any system, there's always resistance and friction. And I think that's a challenge. I think bringing people together and building consensus is always a challenge, because people have different motivations, as Imran said. They have different thoughts, ideas, and when you're trying to move the ball forward on an issue or a topic, and you got to bring these different, disparate, diverse opinions together, it can be very challenging, and I think that's been a challenge for me. And then there's in my specific scenario of this political civic space, there's an inherent challenge of the need to kind of, I guess, explain to people or convince them in a sense, why does this even matter? Or why is this important? And I think not just in our communities, but in a lot of communities, there's a lot of apathy around, well, if I put my time, energy, and resources into civics, politics, government, does it actually do anything? Is it worth anything? Can I actually change anything? And there's a major obstacle there in being able to show people that actually it can have an impact, and it does have an impact. And if we're not doing it, then we're actually missing out as a community, because we're not able to address inequities that affect us and our neighbors and friends and families. So that, I think, actually is the biggest obstacle for me.
I think just to quickly follow up on that, right? Like we're 86 days away from the next big election, right? Like why is it important for us as a community to be civically engaged at this time? If you
Yeah,
want to expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I've been kind of working from home in this COVID environment. Or I have been working from home throughout COVID, and I thought, oh, what am I going to do all day? Like I can work and probably relax a little bit. It's been really, every day blows by, and I can't believe now we're 86 days away from a major election, and there's a lot of apathy, to be honest, especially in traditionally disenfranchised communities of people who see, what's happening on TV, what's on the news. They're like, well, can I really do something? And is our system fair? Is it equitable? And does me voting actually make a difference? And I think it's important for us to mobilize, because no matter what side of the aisle you're on, you look at the results of, elections going back to the year 2000, and you see that some of these, or many of these, even presidential races, were decided by, less than 1,000 votes. I'm sure in the Ismaili community alone, we would have had enough votes to make an impact in the 2000 election, where George W. Bush won by 500 and some change, right? And you look at the election of Trump and losing, or he won Michigan by 10,000 votes. So the margins are very tight now because the nation is very polarized. And what really makes a difference is who's able to mobilize their constituencies and their supporters. And I think as Ismaili Muslims and Muslims broadly, there is a lot of gains that can be had by mobilizing, and it would help address a lot of the inequities that we see in our society. Just lastly, if you look at kind of the change that's happened from a policy perspective in our country over the last 4 years, one different vote this way or that way, one state going this way or that way, could really make a big difference in the trajectory of our nation, no matter what direction you personally believe in. So it's really, really important. It's really important.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, I hope that's a good call to action for everyone out there. But Imran, if you want to touch a little bit about some of the barriers and the obstacles that you faced in your time.
Yeah, of course. I think for me, a lot of it is self-imposing your own beliefs on other people. So when I moved to Dar es Salaam to work for this aviation company, I had always lived in the United States. I moved to East Africa for the first time, and I was approaching things always from my viewpoint and my lens. And I was often finding an internal struggle of, is what I know correct, or is what the community and society doing in Tanzania correct? And I'll give you one example. I had a housekeeper, and there the norm is to pay everyone at the end of the month. And here I'm used to getting paid twice a month. And I thought that, so immediately I told my housekeeper, I'm going to pay you twice a month. She was, was a little uncomfortable, but, I chalked it up to just feeling shy, and, the culture is a little bit different. About a week or two later, someone came to me and said, actually, that my housekeeper went and spoke to that person and said, actually, here, if your housekeeper doesn't want the money right away, because then people will know, and she will then end up running out of the money before the end of the month. Because people will come to her and say, you have some money, can I please have it? So actually, she didn't even want it. And she wanted to be able to stay with kind of the societal norms, because that was going to be much easier for her. So again, for me, my challenge always comes back to myself, of not understanding what, the situation enough, the context enough, and trying to jump in. And trying to make a lot of statements rather than asking questions. And I find that if I ask questions about why things exist the way they do, I become a lot more informed, and the barriers reduce.
Okay, yeah. Samira, do you want to tell us a little bit about some of the barriers that you've faced?
More and more, I find that the bigger challenges in the work that I do is building bridges across communities, across sectors, sometimes even across geographies. There is I mean, humans are tribal people, right? We're a tribal species. So we're going to stick to the things that we know. And sometimes you'll find, the people on this side of Flatbush Avenue versus the people on that side of Flatbush Avenue. Turns out that that's a divide. Doesn't make any sense. It's not that big an avenue. But yet it becomes one more thing that you have to literally sometimes build a bridge across. I run a bank, so it's very, in many ways, it's very technical. Make sure you get the accounting right. You have to get all of the pennies distributed in everybody's account. And the temptation for a very long time, especially as we were starting out and trying to get sustainable and trying to make sure that the loans and the accounts were working, the temptation was to stay with that, like to stay in the accounting, stay in the day-to-day, stay on the operations, figure out why the Visa cards aren't working. And not worry about these larger questions of coalition building or of advocacy or systemic change. We just wanted to stay with what we knew. And once the credit union was able to reach certain benchmarks in terms of its sustainability and in terms of its reach, then I found myself getting pulled more and more into these conversations about, well, why aren't you talking to those guys? Why aren't you opening a branch 2 miles away? Why don't you have different types of tellers in your office and not just the 3 that you've had for the last 5 years? And I found myself getting more and more drawn into some of these battles. We could dismiss them at the outset as just politics, just people trying to, make trouble, ignore the haters. But it became clear that paying specific and deliberate attention to those other communities, you can't just dismiss them as the haters. You're going to need them if you want to be able to build a coalition, and if you're going to want to affect systemic change. The credit union can serve, 15, 20,000 people a year, and that's great. We started at 0. But that doesn't mean, I'm in a city of 8 million and I'm in a county of 2 million. Even the neighborhoods we serve are 1 million people, of which only 15,000 are affected by the credit union. So if I'm ever going to break past those types of barriers, then I need to build coalitions. Then I need to be able to articulate viewpoints that other people can sign on to, regardless of which side of Flatbush Avenue you live on. So I found that understanding these turf battles was critical. And then the hard part after that is still finding the common grounds that we can build forward on.
I think, there's so much diversity in sort of the barriers that all of you have faced. I think one of the questions that I want to follow up with for all 3 of you is, when you all decided to sort of take this leap, right, to go do these big, unique things to try and upend systemic inequities, what were the reactions of those around you? What did your friends, your family have to sort of say about it? And then what are some of the ways you coped with those reactions? And how do you how did you sort of work with what everyone was thinking in the face of sort of the obstacles and challenges around what everyone else's reactions were? And how did that change how you define success for yourself in that space? And how do you currently define, success for yourself in the space that you're in now? And Farooq, I think we can start with you.
Yeah, I think, family and friends were supportive, but there was skepticism because, again, it's, can this be done? Are you wasting your time? Because you're going up against a major headwind. And do you actually think that this effort will yield the results that you want? And it's, it's to be determined, right? I mean, when you're building institutions, it takes a long time. Just wearing the hat of M-Gage, because I've got a few different hats, we're probably 12 years into this. And I think one metric of success is the fact that we've survived this long. I mean, I think most people say that if a nonprofit makes it beyond 5 years, like that's when you know that they have some level of sustainment. So survival has been good. I think impact has been good, but the metrics for success change, I think, based on where you are on the time horizon. And I think for the most part, even in Muslim communities, there was a lot of skepticism around whether an organization like this could exist in the ecosystem of other communities that have much stronger and much better resourced institutions than our communities do. And it's challenging. I mean, there's days where I was worried. Our organization is run by full-time employees, and it's professionally run. And there have been days where I'm like, I don't know if I can make payroll tomorrow, right? It's like almost like running a business and being a startup, and you have people whose livelihoods depend on your ability to keep the work going, and you got to go and get people's buy-in and support. Because if you don't get the buy-in and support, the work's not going to get done because you're not going to have the resources you need to get it done. So there have been a lot of struggles from that perspective, and whether it's doing this work or anything else that people want to do when it comes to social change, you got to grind it out. Like there's going to be days where it's just you're wondering, why am I even doing this, and what's even the point? And you just got to get through it. And for me, my faith is a big part of what keeps me going, because it's the inspiration and the motivation of the work. So I think that's really important, because if you don't have that, it makes it more difficult to weather the tough times that come when you're trying to do any kind of social impact, social justice work.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And I think like that, like I think, yeah, like there's definitely that feeling of, am I making an impact? So I can definitely relate to that. Samira, what about you?
Your question is wanting to know how I know I'm making it, the definitions of success, right? And how did everyone feel when I started off? It took a lot of explaining when I started off, and I would give up very often because it didn't make sense to anybody. There was no precedent. There was no context for, like, I'm going to volunteer in a low-income neighborhood, not full of Desis or Indian people, just full of other types of American poor people, and I'm going to do it for free. So yeah, I was able to ignore that because of the support of my parents and my sister. Right now, the measures of success are entirely related to the sustainability of the credit union and of the work that we do. Yeah.
That's
Hope
great
that
to hear. And no, I think it does. I think I think it makes a lot of sense. I think sometimes you just have to do what you're passionate about and try to impact your community the way you best see fit with your skill set. So I think that,
I mean, it continues to be difficult to explain to, like, sometimes people ask me to talk to college students and be like, could you, like, career day, explain what you do? And, it's still, especially in a Smiley context and within a, like, a Jamaati panel or something, it still gets hard to explain what I'm doing, because it's, and I don't know whether it's because we're still largely defined as an immigrant community, but there's, like, all the other people on the panel are corporate people, or they, they're highly accomplished. They'll be small business owners. They'll be doctors for sure. But the idea of making a career in social justice or in activism, it takes a bunch of explaining.
Yeah, I think, yeah, and I think, like, what I think has been a blessing for myself and a lot of young people who have grown up doing programs like Global Encounters, right, is being able to spend time seeing a lot of our facilitators, people like Imran, people and all the others who sort of chart their path by dedicating their time towards social justice. And just having those role models has made it so much easier, I know, for a lot of young people, including me. And so I think that is something that I am personally deeply grateful for. But Imran, with that, I pass it to you to sort of talk about how people felt and then how you sort of define success.
Yeah, so I think that like Farooq and Samira both have mentioned, and I may have already mentioned, that this has been a strong part of my faith. So I have been very lucky, I think, because I was operating within a space of what was part of our community values. So I got a lot of support from our community in terms of trying to bring social change. I do remember when I was moving to Africa, some of my professional network, people who were not as well versed internationally, this was in 2014 when Ebola was really kind of spiking, cases were spiking in West Africa. They were automatically concerned about Ebola, even though there weren't any cases in East Africa, and they were automatically concerned about my security and my safety. So sometimes you do get resistance from your own people when you're trying to do things, and that's even harder. It's not even the opposition, it's like your own people are more critical of you, and how do you kind of balance that? I think that another thing I would say is when you're like in the throes of it and you're really kind of trying to work on it, it could be very stressful. It could get daunting. It could get overwhelming. And I know a lot of people, including myself, have kind of struggled with that. And one piece of advice that I wanted to pass from my own experiences is that, you have to be able to have coping mechanisms. You have to be able to be grounded. You need confidants. You need people to help give you advice. And things like exercise, yoga, going to the gym, that's usually the first thing that people give up when life gets really hectic. But I like to say it's, or I've learned that that's when it's the most important and should be the last thing that you give up, because it will keep you sane and grounded.
Yeah, I think a lot of us, can identify with, having to explain to our own about some of the life choices that we're choosing to make in the pursuit of social justice. So I think that's something that all of us can relate to. I think it's enough of our questions on my end. I think we want to take some questions from the audience. Here's a question that we've gotten that I think Samira and Farooq can answer. When many of you are essentially working away at social justice and eradicating inequalities, is there concern that these individual organizations would be exploited by larger organizations? Would it be easier for you to work with established organizations? Samira, do you want to take the first crack at that?
Am I concerned that large organizations would exploit our credit union?
Or that would it be easier to work with established organizations? That's a question that's come in from the audience.
Yeah, for sure, easier. Yeah, totally. Super much. I mean, not that maybe they wouldn't hire me. There's that, but yeah, it's quite different to do this. Sometimes I find myself having more in common with little startup firms. Sometimes, like, I read about the profiles of Silicon Valley, entrepreneurs. I got nothing in common with any of those IT people. It feels like, except, these challenges of starting an organization and starting a business too, right? Like, we are a nonprofit, of course, all credit unions are, but I also compete in retail financial services with the big guys. 3 blocks away is the Citibank and 4 blocks away is the Capital One. So how do my products and services distinguish themselves from those of mainstream organizations? So that's a critical question, and that's the same question that these startup entrepreneurs at these other fields are also facing. So I find myself oftentimes relating to their life stories and how they think about distinguishing their products and services in a crowded marketplace. It's also interesting to listen and read about how other organizations are trying to implement the values of inclusiveness and equity within the organization when it comes to staffing and hiring, and putting forth a value statement to what the organization stands for. So those are really hard questions. Hiring in particular is a very fraught question. Would it be easier if I worked for a large organization? Yes, it would be easier. Is it something that I regret doing? No, I don't regret it.
That's good to know. That's great. Farooq, what about you? Would it have been easier to, I think, get more people civically engaged by working for a larger political organization?
Maybe, but you may not be able, at least in my case, I don't think that that the people that I work with at Mgage would have been able to have that same tailored approach to what Muslim American communities are specifically interested in and wanting to organize around. I guess it could have been easier, but it would have been a very different experience. And I think part of the question was, could larger organizations exploit the smaller one? I think, look, we've got competitors, right? So I think the larger organizations are in many cases representing interests that are different from our interests. So that's an everyday battle, I guess,
Yeah, definitely. And I think like being able to have your own organization helps you set sort of your own objectives and your own metrics for the change that you want to be able to create. This is a really powerful question, I think, that's coming from the audience. What is the greatest threat to the prospects of civil rights and social justice today, in your opinion? Imran, I think we can start with you.
Okay. I think I would say ignorance. I would say lack of curiosity, lack of understanding, the desire to only look at things from your viewpoint and your position, and the fear for change, or fear of change. Like I said earlier, we all lose things as we try to bring progress. But I think sometimes it's important to remember that we usually say that people don't like change, but actually they do if it's in their interest. No one's going to say no to a raise at work, or more responsibilities if it's going to get a huge raise at work, or more money. So how do we bring change in people's interests, and how do we make sure that curiosity and the love for like progress is always top of mind?
Yeah. Samira, what about you? What would you say are the greatest threats to the prospect of civil rights and social justice today?
I think apathy, and I think and sometimes it's well founded, the belief by individuals that there's nothing that they can do, that this is the way it is, and that people more powerful and important than they are really the ones who are governing our life choices. It's hard to explain. Sometimes I have to give the analogy as to why someone would choose a small credit union versus a global bank for their financial services. And I have to bring up the example of like, the small coffee shop on your block, which is maybe owned by an immigrant or Black owned small business. And why would you go to them versus the Starbucks or the Dunkin' Donuts? And the temptation is to go to the Starbucks because you know what's on the menu, and it's always going to be the same no matter which Starbucks you go into, and it's well established as to what you're supposed to do when you get there. Like, you stand on this line and you order here and you pick up over there. Small businesses, by contrast, are quirky. They have all kinds of stuff on their menu that you never heard of, and you don't know where you're supposed to stand to put the order in, and the prices could be all over the map. So there is more uncertainty, and you're taking a bigger risk by choosing the small coffee shop instead of the Starbucks. I would say that it's overwhelmingly, however, positive to choose the small business. You want to be able to support small businesses. No community thrives with only big box stores. Making that choice is harder. It takes a little bit more deliberation at the outset. You have to look for where that little Black-owned coffee shop might be, and maybe you have to go a block or two out of your way. But those kinds of small choices can make a tremendous impact. And the hard part is convincing people that does work. That going 2 blocks out of your way for the other little tiny coffee shop instead of just standing at the Starbucks at the corner matters.
Okay. Farooq, what about you?
Well, I think we are a long way away for achieving equal rights and social justice for all. But I think that when you have leaders who are enablers for bigotry, discrimination, and a lack of respect for our Constitution, I think that's, to me, a very big problem. And as long as you have that, I don't see how you can make any progress. So I think that's today a big barrier and a big threat.
Right. Agreed. Another really good question that's come in from a younger member of the audience is, what is the best way to engage with older members of our Jamaat when it comes to matters of social justice? Samira, do you want to take this one first?
I have no experience in that. How would I relate to the older members of the Jamaat in terms of social activism? Aye. Okay, maybe someone else who does this might have a better answer. I'm sorry.
Imran, do you want to take a crack at it?
I mean, you're a young member of the Jamaat, Rayhaan. What do you think?
I think it's, for me, when I talk to my parents or when I talk to other members of my family and I'm trying to explain to them the current events of the day, I sometimes have to bring it back to our faith, right? I have to bring it back to what our Imam says when it comes to us talking about pluralism, when it comes to us talking about like being members of our community that are actively serving the rest of the population, and what our faith stands for, from the points about equality and fighting against bigotry and fighting against hate and standing up against oppression. I think a lot of it has to come back to the work of our Imam over the last 60 years. And I think having sort of the words of the Imam and having that lens of this comes back to our faith is a really powerful tool for us to be able to engage with older members of the Jamaat. Like, I can't understate, it's very different when I'm telling you something versus like when I have a farman to back myself up and how my parents and others feel about that. So I think like that is, I think, one way to do it. Do any of you have like other thoughts, Farooq?
Yeah, I'd like to expand a little. I think you're right on the money, Rayhaan, but just to kind of look at it from an even longer view, I think as Muslims, and specifically as Shia Muslims, we have generations of leadership to look back to on these issues. I mean, think about the fact that Prophet Muhammad, we just celebrated Eid al-Ghadir yesterday. Think about the fact that Prophet Muhammad in his final sermon said there's no difference between black and white. That was 1600 years ago. And think about Imam Ali, who said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that there's two types of people, my brothers in faith or my equals in humanity. And then you have the example of Imam Hussein, who stood up against tyranny and oppression as well. So we've got 49 examples to look to, not, you know what I mean? So I think when we have that long view of our history, this is implanted and ingrained in our tradition. And I think when we can articulate that, not just to elder members of our Jamaat, but to even others outside of our community, I think that's a really powerful way to kind of package how our faith drives or should drive this type of social action.
Yeah, and I think that's like I think that's really well articulated, right? That the history of our faith is to upend systemic inequity. This is not a new practice for us. This is something that we as a community have been trying to do for a very, very long time. One of our final audience questions is, how do you recommend folks in our community who are beginning their careers in these fields to work through, process, and dismantle oppressive practices within our own community and culture? What advice can you give us to challenge the inequities that we see around us after this webinar today? Anyone want to go first?
Can you repeat, do you mind repeating the question?
Sure thing. How do you recommend the folks in our community who are beginning their careers in these fields to work through, process, and dismantle oppressive practices within our community and culture? What advice can you give us to challenge inequities around us after this webinar today?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot that can be done, at least from the civic and political space. I think a bare minimum thing is voting, right? Like, voting should be, like one of my close friends has said, voting should be like breathing, right? It should be the bare minimum of what we do in terms of civic participation. There's so much other stuff that can be done, right? Like, I think there's opportunity for those of you who are maybe in high school and college to volunteer time, to get involved, to be present. I think half of the battle in that space is being there. There's so many times when I just happen to be the only Muslim in the room and somebody said something really inappropriate. And I was like, well, wait a second, you shouldn't have said that. But imagine if we weren't even in the room. Like, who knows what's being said when we're not in the room? So I think being present is a big part of it. And look, I think there's opportunities for people to, especially right now, volunteer on campaigns, work on campaigns, and even run for office possibly. But I would say one piece of advice I would give, and I've kind of seen this, over the last several years is, we're not always going to get everything. And there is definitely a process to work through to affect change. And sometimes we have to work through that process rather than trying to burn down the whole process. So I would say that, consider as people are getting involved in stuff, what is the best mechanism to actually get to the end state? And sometimes that might take more time, but it might be more achievable if you work at it a certain way.
I think that's really good advice. Imran or Samira, do you want to add on to that?
I would say that kind of going back to an earlier observation that that the temptation of all kinds of communities is to stay within themselves and to be tribal, and to think about the things that concern them the most. And I think it might be worthwhile, though it's certainly a long road, to do that within our community. There are many challenges that our older generations have faced, and I'm thinking of the part of our community that had to flee East Africa and the troubles there. And I know that for a lot of people, at least in our Jamaat, those are lived experiences. Those are their lived memories, and that's another thing that kind of pushes an insularity and a preference to just not trying to be more and not trying to be visible, not trying to draw attention to who we are and the work that we do. I've been, observing with a great deal of enthusiasm these initiatives. You referred earlier to the global encounters, and maybe even talks like this, critical conversations that try to go to kind of point a different direction. It's possible to have these conversations within that community, and to kind of ask, what would it take to be a little bit more visible, to be a little bit more forthright and affirmative? Because I think that our faith and that a lot of the bedrock principles that we espouse on a daily basis, specifically this idea of seva, the idea that the entire Jamaat Khana, all the Jamaat Khanas everywhere, are run entirely on volunteer labor, and they run beautifully. And our Jamaat Khanas are just wonderful spaces. And this is all seva that brings this to you. I think those kinds of principles, because we live them, maybe we don't see how revolutionary they can be. Maybe there's a way we can start to be receptive and affirmative and opening up conversations about what it is that we might have to offer as a community to the world outside. It involves a risk because we would have to open up, and that is a process. But I feel hope in that there are younger generations that are trying that, especially you guys also on the call, Imran and Farooq. So I would say that if there's some place to start, it's within us and within some of these volunteer efforts, and being able to articulate really proudly what we do and why we do it.
I think it's really important for us to be able to articulate our faith and why we're sort of, fighting for the justice that we are at times. I think that's critical. Imran, what about you?
Yeah, I think your question was around what advice do we have for young people who are trying to get into working on social justice issues, right? I would say, look, what the other panelists said, I think are also really important, that sometimes we get into situations where we're apathetic, where we're complacent, and it takes people who are new onto the scene with a new, fresh perspective to be able to hold up a mirror and say, why are we doing these things the way we're doing them? How can we be doing them differently? At the same time, I would say that, take the time to understand why they're being done the way they're being done. Take time to understand what the perspectives are. I think you mentioned, how to dismantle oppressive practices. If everybody thought it was oppressive, then it would be done away with. So why are the people who don't think it's oppressive think that, right? How do you get to understand that? And then lastly, how do you pace the work so that you don't get burnt out and you don't put all of yourself in it, and then after a year be like, look, I failed and that was it. So now I'm going to move on to something else. So I would say experiment with different things with what you're working on. So different interventions. and see what works and what doesn't work. And, you know, sometimes it's just the way you say something, the word choice, the timing, you know, and try to experiment with all of those things and see, can you yield different results? And hopefully that will build your toolkit. So as you move on throughout life, you will have more experiences on how to be more effective.
I think that's really great advice. And I think like it's a good point that if an oppressive practice isn't deemed oppressive by everyone, then you can't get rid of it. And the first battle is changing those minds. And so I think that's a really important point. I think that is it on our end for all the audience questions that we have. Just want to take a second and thank all of the speakers and thank the audience for joining us today. Hopefully this is just the start of the critical conversation, and you all will engage on it after this as well. Today was an incredible treat for me to be able to moderate, and I was incredibly inspired to hear the stories of all of our panelists and how they're living the ethics of their faith and pursuing social justice in their everyday lives through their careers and the work that they're doing. Thank you all again. A couple of announcements on our end before we hop off. Please look out for more info on d.ismaili/USA on the webpage and our social media for young adult conversations that are coming up this week and our next critical conversation. Another webinar that's coming up this week from ITREB USA presents A Stronger Future Built on the Foundations of Our Faith by Dr. Devin Stewart from Emory University's Department of Middle East and South Studies. For a talk highlighting the contributions of Shiite scholars to the knowledge society of their times, and which became a foundation to becoming and making the Arabo-Islamic culture. This webinar is going to be moderated by Eliza Dr. Nargis Virani, and it'll be on Thursday, August 13th at 8 p.m. Central Time. To register, there's a link which I believe we're going to go ahead and drop into the chat box. I'm hoping that you all can go ahead and register. There is also going to be a survey after this session that'll pop out on your screen just as you leave. So make sure to fill that out just to give us feedback for our next set of critical conversations. Thank you all, and Yali Mada, thank you again to all of our panelists.